Hello and welcome to part 3 of my deconstruction of Bernardo Kastrup's video series on analytic idealism. This is a deconstruction or comment, whatever term you want to put on it, on his part 2 called The Incoherence of Mainstream Physicalism. So let's just jump into it. If I can get it started. There it is.
Welcome to part 2 of Essential Foundations course on analytic idealism. In part 1, we've seen that our screen of perception, the things we see, hear, touch, smell, and taste, the screen of perception is not a transparent window into the world. It doesn't show us the world as it acts.
If I could stop it. Sorry about that. But it's interesting that he said, and I might even want to go back a bit here.
Parent window, perception, the things we see, the Foundations course on analytic idealism. In part 1, we've seen that our screen of perception, the things we see, hear, touch, smell.
The things we see, hear, touch, and smell, right? See, hear, touch, and smell. And there's a fifth sense I can. So there's smelling, seeing, hearing, tasting, and touching, right? So, but he's basically referring to the 5 senses. That's an important thing I would like you to keep in the back of your mind, that he mentions this, right? See, hearing, touch, and taste, and so on, right? 5 senses. That's what he directly refers to here, right? So just keep it in mind that he mentioned this.
And taste. The screen of perception is not a transparent window into the world. It doesn't show us the world as it actually is in and of itself.
Well, it's transparent. It has to have some transparency in order for you to... And the abstract understanding of a transparency, but not as a window frame or window pane, but in the sense that the transparency is that something arriving from the outside from which you create some kind of experience. The qualia. Now, it's if it makes sense for me to say something has to arrive from that outside to ignite some kind of experience, which you can then objectify somehow, objectifying saber-toothed tiger, rabbits, trees, so on, clouds, and so on, right? But it's it's axiomatic, because you can't know if it's just a demon, as Descartes would say, that just connects things in a fashion that makes it look like you are actually having something arriving from your outside, and they're sort of the senses are aligned. What's the word I'm looking for? When you, if you see a tree, for instance, and you walk towards that tree, when you expect to feel, if you move your hand close to your tree, you're not experiencing it yet, but at the exact moment when you expect to experience it, you are experiencing the feel of the tree. So it's sort of, what's the word? It's aligned. It's not. It's another word that is better than aligned. But every senses are aligned so that one sense can confirm another sense, so to say, if you get my drift, right? That would seem kind of weird if that wasn't some kind of outside that you are using more than one sense in order to qualify, right? And the qualification, they are aligned so that when you expect to have a particular sense based on another sense, you are exactly getting that sense, right? Usually, at least, right? Unless the tree is, whatever. I guess it never occurs that unless there's some change in that sense which you want to justify using another sense, you usually get what you expect. Otherwise, it's like if I thought it was a tree and then it was a piece of chocolate, let's say, right? I would still feel it, but I would say, wow, that doesn't feel like a tree. That feels like chocolate, right? But then you're just sort of changing your conceptualizations, right? Okay. So it makes sense axiomatically to say there's something arriving from the outside that creates or that has some kind of responsibility for your qualia, right? And that transparency is sort of metaphysical transparency, but what passes through that transparency is not the things themselves, right? It's not an elephant arriving through that transparency. It's not the color that arrives through that transparency. It's not the thing themselves in any understanding of. It's at least it's another thing that arrives to you than the thing you are trying to describe, according to the structure of the scaffolding of your experience, right? So you are disconnected from it, and it has to travel through that transparency in order to become some or be responsible for some kind of experience that you can then experience, right? And objectify. So it's sort of yes, it's a transparency, but it's when you have the outside-inside dichotomy, that's where you accept that there is sort of, let's say, distance between things, right? And if you're distance from an outside world, you are disconnected from it, right? Otherwise, you are the world, right? If you are not the world, then you're disconnected from that world. So whatever, I mean, it just drops out of the whole inside-outside dichotomy, right? Your experience cannot be that outside. Otherwise, you are everything, right? You are a solipsist. And then there's no inside-outside dichotomy, right? So it's sort of, you can't have both, right? So if you're saying you're a solipsist, fine. Sit down and wait until you die, right? If I'm not a solipsist, I'm saying there's an outside-inside dichotomy, and I'm working from the action there's an outside. Okay, so if there's an outside, my experiences are on the inside. Otherwise, it makes no sense to have the dichotomy, right? So, and if my experiences are on the inside, well, then I have no idea about that outside beyond my experience of it, right? And if what I have is an experience of an outside, I have particularly no understanding of what that outside actually is, because I only have the experience of it. It's sort of a chain of reasoning that is, when you establish those axioms, it just falls right out of it, in my opinion, right? Okay, I'm rambling a bit here, right? Let's see what Bernardo has to say. This is a 40-minute video Bernardo has made, and I'm not going to comment on all possible things that I might think was commendable or suitable for a comment. And also, if I have commented earlier on the similar kind of statement, I will jump past it this time to keep the running time as low as I can without losing grip on essential stuff, right? So let's see if I can get a little deeper faster this time than the recent. What I was actually trying to say is, I want to wait until the deepest stuff arrives, so I'm not getting bogged down in lesser details that doesn't need that deep analysis, right?
The screen of perception is more like a dashboard of dials, and these dials, these instruments on the dashboard, convey important, accurate information about the world so we can survive. This is what evolution has equipped us with, a dashboard of dials to convey important information about the world. But these dials are not what the world actually looks like, in the same sense that the instrument panel of a pilot flying a plane purely by instrument, that instrument panel is not the world outside. It doesn't look like the clouds, the lightning, the wind, whatever is beyond the windshield of the aircraft. But despite not looking at all like what the world actually is, it conveys accurate and important information that allows the pilot to fly safely purely by instrument. So this is what we are. This is our condition. We are flying purely by instrument. What we see.
Yeah, but flying safely by instrument, that if you transpose that into the metaphysics, this is just an analogy, right? You can't make an analogy from experience, an experiential analogy that explains something that cannot be experienced. So be careful with these, how you interpret these analogies and metaphors. And also, when I use it, be careful that you're not being misled by the example that it can't be transposed directly into an understanding of metaphysics, because an analogy I used to use is a torchlight. And if you think of a torchlight that is outside of you, shining towards you, right? So you're receiving the light's particles, right? Okay, and then you're saying, okay, if I only have that light, there's no other light source. I'm saying that light comes from something, right? But all I receive can be the light. If that torch itself is outside myself, and the only thing I receive is the light, how can I judge what the torch is only by the light, right? Whatever I will come up with will be something based on light and not on torch, right? I might have be able to create some idea from that light what that torch might be, or something that is useful for me to get around handling this sort of torchlight. But whatever I come up with, sort of any kind of qualia or conceptualization about that torch, will be some kind of construct, because I don't know what the torch is, right? So if I'm saying the light must be emitted for some kind of object, right? Then I can never get to the object, because I will only ever get the light from it, right? And whatever I can use, when I sort of twist that light around and create some kind of object from which, within my experience, that represents that torch, that representation can never be like the torch, because the torch is something different from the light it emits, right? But if I only have the light, then it will be something that is created from light and not from torchness, if you get my drift, right? This is sort of, in my thinking, the best analogy that points out the impossibility, unlikelihood, you could say, that your experience is anything like what you are trying to get an understanding, an existence, the understanding of existence you're trying to get to, right? It's all based on something that is not that which you're trying to get to, right? The sound of an elephant is not an elephant, right? The taste of an elephant is not an elephant, right? The elephant is something you add to it in order to have some idea of what the hell is going on out there, right? But that doesn't mean there are elephants out there, right? Just because your mind created an elephant. So, okay.
See, hear, touch, taste, and smell are the instruments. Vision is an instrument. It's a dial on the dashboard. So is taste, so is touch, so is hearing, and so on.
Please keep in mind, stay with this see, hear, and taste, touch, and feel.
They're all the dials, the instruments evolution has equipped us with. But the world, as it actually is, doesn't need to comply at all with the paradigm of the dashboard. In other words, things like space, extension, the passage of time, objects, discrete objects, even forms themselves, they belong in the dashboard. They are the extensions or dimensions of the dashboard. The world as it actually is doesn't need at all to comply with this paradigm, this spatio-temporal paradigm of forms and extension and the passage of time. It can be something that is for us literally unimaginable and inconceivable, because we can only conceive and visualize things that are in some way commensurable with the paradigm of perception. Perception feeds our imagination, our ability to conceive and visualize things. So whatever is incommensurable with the paradigm of perception is in principle inconceivable to us. So we are immersed and living in a literally mysterious and inconceivable world. And what we see and hear, what we perceive in general, is just, the dials in our dashboard conveying the information we need to survive and to maintain our structural and dynamical integrity despite the second law of thermodynamics. So all of this has...
The second law of thermodynamics is just, a human subjective kind of observation. It's based on empirical, so it's based on knowledge, it's based on empiricism and abstractions about what that energy might actually be, because it's not that easy to define what the hell energy is. Energy is something that can do work, but that doesn't explain what it is, right? If you say, ask me what is a car? Well, a car is something that can get you from A to B, but that doesn't explain what a car is, right? So, but energy, well, it's fuel, but fuel is just a liquid, right? Or coal or whatever, right? What is that energy thing? Well, it's actually, I would say, impossible to answer other than what it can be used for. And that's the whole point of the experience, in my opinion. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is, what the hell can I do with it, right? The 4F is, should I flee from it? Should I feed on it? Should I fuck it? Or should I, fighting, fleeing, fucking, and feeding, right? Should I fight it? Should I flee? Should I fuck it? Should I feed it? Should I eat it, right? Should I fight it because it's dangerous? Should I run away from it because it's overpowering? Should I eat it, or should I, have children with it, right? It's like, what can I do with it, right? If I experience saber-toothed tiger, I'm not really that interested in what the hell it is, right? I'm interested in what the hell should I do with it, right? So we are not actually really human beings. We are human doings in a sense, right? Even though that it's usually a term sort of used on men, that men are human doings and women are human beings. But and because men are human doings, they can keep women alive so they can stay human beings. Okay, that's another talk. But in a general sense, we are more like human doings than we are human beings, right? We are humans who are interested, what the hell can I do with this, right? That goes so far back that it doesn't matter what a piece of flint is, but what matters is, what the hell can I do with it, right? I can create a knife, I can create an axe, I can have a throwing stone, I can this, that, and the other. That's what matters. Because energy is about doing, it's not about being, right? Energy is something that does work, right? And the structure, as you pointed out, is something to do with energy. And energy is something that does work. It's not something that explains existence, right? So it doesn't matter what a flint is. It doesn't matter what a berry is. It doesn't matter what the sun is. What matters is, should I fight it, flee it, fuck it, or feed on it, right?
Being covered in part 1. I will be linking part 1 in the description of this video. If you haven't watched it, I would recommend that you do watch it first, even though I already gave you a summary. Do watch that first before you watch this part 2. And in this part 2, we are going to talk more specifically not only about the incoherence of our intuitions of what reality is, but specifically the incoherence of our mainstream metaphysics, our mainstream narrative about the nature of reality. In other words, mainstream physicalism, or metaphysical materialism, whatever you want to call this, the notion that matter, this thing that is describable purely by quantities, is the only thing that exists, and that qualities and experience and consciousness and mentation, these are all somehow secondary phenomena. So this is mainstream physicalism. We will be talking much more specifically about this in this part 2. So let's get going. Now, physicalism assumes that the shapes and forms, or the contours of the things in the world as they appear on the screen of perception, really are the forms of the world as the world is in and of itself. So, although physicalism will grant...
What does the term in and of itself? It's actually a term that Bernardo Kastrup uses very frequently. What it is in and of itself. It's just me that is who's unclear about what does in and of itself mean. What it is in itself. Why do you need to say in and of itself? If you have an idea, please write a comment. Enlighten me. Please tell me.
That the colors we see, they are qualities, and therefore they are generated by our brains inside our skull. Really out there are no colors, there are no qualities, there are only electromagnetic vibrations of certain frequencies, but they do not have the quality of redness or blueness or whiteness and so forth. So materialism grants that these qualities are only inside our heads, but it goes ahead and says that the abstract geometrical relationships of the world do correspond to the contours we see on the screen of perception. So there is a very important sense, very major sense, in which physicalism says that, well, the world is actually largely the way it presents itself on the screen of perception, because the forms...
No, the world. Now you're saying the world. What do you mean? Do you mean the experiential world, or that unknowable thing that you do not have access to? So it's sort of, please make sure that you stay clear about this, right? Now he's saying the world presents itself, right? Now he's talking about that demon out there, right? Oh, you know, it takes many shapes. There's a shapeshifter, this demon, right? Now he's just called it the world, right? And it presents itself. That is as if he's saying, well, there's something guiding your experience to become in a certain way, so you will get some kind of certain particular understanding of the experiential version of this which you do not have access to. Presents itself. It's just a poor choice of words, right? It sounds like sort of a slightly sophist way of putting some kind of determinism or something into your experience, right? You have no way of saying that. It's pure fabulation. Now I know it may be just a poor choice of words, but I have to point it out then, right? This is a very poor choice of words.
Are the same in both on the dashboard of...
And maybe I could treat it as sort of a Freudian slip, that he actually believes there's something outside basically manifesting itself in your experience in such a way that it is closer to a useful presentation of that which is outside. I don't know, but it's just, be careful. Be very careful with this. This is where, if you go wrong here, right, you go spectacularly wrong, right?
Dials and in the world outside. Now, in principle, that already doesn't make much sense, right? I mean, the forms and dimensions of the instruments on an instrument panel are not at all the forms of the world out there. You can have circular dials with a circular shape, but the stuff out there doesn't need to be circular. The paradigm of the instrument is defined by evolution to be useful, not to be truthful. So that's already something tricky about mainstream physicalism. It's an assumption that we need not make at all, that we shouldn't make. We do not have any good reason at all to make this kind of assumption. But physicalism does that. And in a nutshell, the assumption is the forms that appear on the screen of perception are actually the forms of the world as it is in itself. So the world does have space extension, spatial extension, and geometrical relationships that are consistent with the geometrical relationships of what appears on the screen of perception, the things we can see. Now, materialism then takes the next step. Having made this arbitrary assumption that the forms of the world are the same as the forms of the screen of perception, of the dashboard of dials, it then makes...
I'm just a little curious why he only talks about forms or shapes, right? Why is he no longer talking about the qualia, the colors, the sounds, the taste, and so on? Why is it only the shapes? It's just like I'm not really sure why is this limited to just talking about shapes now, but okay.
Takes the next step, which is a useful step if it weren't abused. So I'll tell you first what this step is, and then I will explain how physicalism abuses of it. Physicalism then says that the world as it is in itself, the objects whose contours appear on the screen of perception, that those objects can be described through quantities. So for instance, if I have a heavy piece of luggage whose shape, whose form, as it is in itself, is the same as the shape that appears to me when I look at it, and I define that object based on its contours, and I call it a piece of luggage, I can describe, for instance, how heavy it feels to carry that object. I can describe that with a number, like y kilograms. Angles, I can describe with another number, like x degrees. Size, I can describe, or distances, I can describe with another number, like z meters, and so on and so forth. A number for amplitude, another number for frequency, for electric charge, for momentum, spin, and so on. So you get the picture. So these numbers indeed are very useful descriptions of what appear on the screen of perception. It's arbitrary to say that these numbers are describing the world as it is in itself, because the forms on the screen of perception, or the objects as defined by the contours on the screen of perception, do not need at all to be anything like the forms in the world as it is in itself. Even the idea of form belongs in the paradigm of the dashboard, not in the world as it is in itself. But okay, having made that concession, the numbers are useful. But then there is an abusive step. Physicalism forgets that these numbers are merely descriptions of something else. They are descriptions of the thing described. Physicalism then goes ahead and defines this ontological entity, or substance, or ousia, which is the original Greek word which the scholastics have translated into substance. It basically means an entity that has standalone existence, that is ontically real, not secondary, not derivative, not epiphenomenal. So physicalism postulates this substance, this thing with standalone reality that they call matter. Now, of course, there is this thing we call matter colloquially, but physicalism has a strict conceptual definition of what matter is. And that definition entails that matter can be exhaustively defined through quantities alone. In other words, if you provide a complete list of numbers about matter, then you've said everything that there is to say about matter. Nothing is missing. Everything that there is to be said about matter can be said through a list of numbers. Matter can be exhaustively defined through quantities, not qualities. Now, this is a very big step because, one, it's postulating something beyond nature's given. Nature's given, the only thing we have before we start theorizing about reality, is experience. And experience is qualitative in nature. To say that there is something beyond experience, which is purely quantitative in nature as opposed to qualitative is a theoretical postulate. It's not an empirical given. And as a theoretical postulate, a not parsimonious one, because your postulate...
No, I'm breaking into his presentation here. Maybe that's not reasonable, but I want, to break it down a bit, right? I think what he's trying to say that if you are describing the world, you cannot just bring in rulers and thermometers and oscillators and whatever, right? Measuring stick and saying that experience I have over here can be used to measure the whole of the experience, so to say. So what he's actually getting at, I believe, is how should we understand a reduction base to how we approach this idea of our experience, right? And what mainstream physicalism does is just, basically what it does is there's a small stick here that has a certain particular size, right? It has its size. It's not a particular size. It just has size. When I compare to that tree, I can say if I take this size, this tree is so many times this size of that other thing, right? So if, let's say, it's a very small tree, well, the big tree is sort of 16 times the small tree, right? And thereby thinking that you have actually described that tree in any way, or shape, or form. You haven't. You're just, say, compared to that tree, that other tree is sort of 16 times taller than this, 16 times the length of that tree. But you're not explaining anything about the tree or the experience of the tree. You're just comparing stuff in that experience and thinking you're actually getting underneath a deeper understanding of the things themselves. You are not, right? But I'm sort of, I think it's sort of a weird way of arguing, because the foundations of materialism is that you are experiencing the actual outside. It's not whether or not you measure it or have particular instruments or whatever in order to sort of qualify them and in comparison with other things in that experience, right? But let's head into it.
Something extra, you're postulating something beyond the nature's given. It has to be justified. We will look at whether this is actually justified or not, but this is what mainstream physicalism does. It takes these descriptions of the qualities on the screen of perception, it takes those descriptions, and then it postulates an entity that can be fully captured by these quantitative descriptions alone. That after you describe it with a list of numbers, there is nothing more to be said about that. And that's called matter. Now, notice...
Come to think of it, I'm not sure if he actually reaches a bit too far here. I'm not sure that a scientist would think that if you can say that there's 1.7 kilo of apples, that a scientist would think, well, now I am closer to an explanation of what apples are, right? Or that it's red, that explains what apples are. I would think that even scientists and sort of high-functioning materialists, physicalists, would think that. But what I would say is that materialists would think it's given to me that it's an apple, so I don't have to justify it, or because it is, the experience is the actual thing. I don't have to explain it because it's given to me, right? It has been pre-explained to me in order, because it's in my mind. So I think the problem with physicalism is that if you think that the apple is the actual apple outside, why would you need to explain it? Because it's there. It's sort of preordained or pre-explained or something like that, right? But in order to qualify it. There are certain parameters you can measure, like weight and color and taste and sort of, right? In order to, and these have been sort of physically streamlined by these measuring parameters in order to say if it has this pH value, it's a very sour apple, or if it has this color, it's possibly a ripe apple, and so on. So more or less fluffy boundaries there, right? But I think the problem with physicalism is that it makes no sense to a physicalist asking, what does it mean that it's an apple? Because they say, well, it's there, right? When it's like Aristotle said, A is A, right? X is X, and apple is an apple. It's just there. You don't have to explain it. It's there. Until you reach the point that you're saying, okay, the inside-outside dichotomy, as I explained before, and you get to the conclusion that you are merely, be careful with these terms, right? It is a representation of something, and something that I do not have access to. Then the question takes a new shape, right? What is actually there? And that's where I go in and say, you will never get to it. So stop fabulating about it, right?
Is that even the contours, if I go back to this slide, you see these contours here of the city. These are all contours, which physicalism postulates to be in the world as it is in itself and correctly mirrored on the screen of perception. Now, these contours, you're seeing them here because I'm using two colors, black and white, or all colors and the absence of all colors, black and white. And these are qualities. So in a sense, what I'm showing here is not accurate. The contours alone do not have even whiteness or blackness to them, in the sense that both whiteness and blackness are qualities. And the world as it is in itself, according to physicalism, has no qualities because it's purely material. And matter is fully and exhaustively described in terms of quantities alone. It has no qualities. Under mainstream physicalism, qualities are generated inside our skull by our brain. They are not out there in the world. So the world doesn't even have these qualities of black and white contours here. It's not there. So am I cheating? Well, not really, because I cannot...
Careful again about stating what is out there and not, right? Yes, we can go with the idea that it's not like the experience, but that doesn't enable us to say that there's something that isn't out there, right? That there might be something out there, right? How could you possibly know? So these categorical sort of, this can't be out there, or this must be out there, or anything like that, it's all fabulation. It's all, baseless mumbo jumbo guesswork, right? I'm sticking to this point where he constantly tries to linguistically step into that area and try to groom you into have some kind of notion what might be there and what can't be there, or what should be there, or what maybe is there, and so on, right? So if what you have is your experience, and as he says, you have your sense qualia, that is what you've got to work with, right?
Not help you visualize something that has no qualities at all, since every visualization entails some form of qualities. So in reality, what is really out there are just the geometrical relationships, the abstract geometrical relationships entailed by these little contours that I am showing you here. But the world as it is in itself, you can't even visualize like these black contours on a white background. It's pure abstraction. It's not visual, it's not visualizable. The best you could do is to imagine it as empty space with floating mathematical equations, like I'm trying to show here. But even that goes too far, because it also has colors. The world as it is in itself, according to mainstream physicalism, is pure abstraction. Absolutely pure abstraction. And now comes the worst step physicalism makes. We are part of the world. And as such, we too are only these little abstract contours, these geometrical relationships described fully through quantities and and equations that relate quantities to one another. When we look at the world here, there we are a little contour looking at other contours, then something magic happens here inside this abstract object called the brain, and poof, the qualities come into existence. So the world we actually experience, the world of color, sounds, flavors, melodies, textures, that world, according to mainstream physicalism, exists only here, inside our head. If you look up to the sky at night and you experience the qualities that we call the stars, those stars, insofar as you see them, are below the inner surface of your actual skull. Because the qualities of the night sky, which is all we have when we look up and see the night sky, they are supposed to be generated by your brain inside your skull. There is something abstract beyond your skull, which we call a star. But that something abstract is not your experience of the stars. It's something abstract that supposedly is modulating your experience of the stars. But the experience we call seeing the stars happens inside your skull. The inner surface of your skull is beyond the night sky insofar as the night sky you experience, that you see. That is mainstream physicalism in a nutshell for you. Now, notice what's happening here. We start from a world of qualities. And then we say we can describe those qualities through quantities, like kilograms, hertz, amplitudes, charge, momentum, geometrical relationships, angles, and so on and so forth. So that's a description of the world of qualities, which is all we have. And then mainstream physicalism goes and says, actually, all that exists is the description. This world of qualities here is epiphenomenal. It may not even actually exist. It may be an illusion. All that exists is this abstract world of contours and quantities. That's all that exists. This here is an illusion generated inside your head. And then physicalism says, and these qualities here, they are somehow generated by these abstract quantitative contours here, your brain. So this is basically saying that that which is described somehow arises from the description. That somehow the description of the thing precedes and is more primary than the thing described. It's completely analogous to trying to pull the territory out of the map, because what is a map? A map is a description of the territory. We all start with the territory. We all start with experience. That's what we have when we are 5 years old, before we start conceptually theorizing and coming up with these crazy narratives like mainstream physicalism. That's all we have. And then we find out that it's very useful to describe those qualities with numbers, and it definitely is very useful to do that. But then, that's like creating a map, and maps are very useful. And physicalism then says, well, the experiences actually arise from their description. The territory arises from the map. Is this reasonable? Is this even sane?
It's not reasonable. It's not reasoned very well, right? So it's sort of... it's all of the cognitive apparatus and memories and in inductions and deductions and everything sort of is piled together in sort of something that makes sense, but it's functional because it functions at least to some degree, right? If you're a Stone Age person and you say, well, what I experience is outside myself, you will actually have more survivability than someone who sits down there thinking, I'm not sure that that's outside myself, that thing there, right? So at some point they will be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or trampled on by a mammoth or something like that, right? The Stone Age person that says, That experience is something outside myself. I either have to fuck it, flee it, fight it, or whatever, right? So the mainstream physicalism is an artifact of evolution, right? It takes a huge imaginative leap to classify your experience as purely something that experiential rather than the thing itself. It's almost like you are downgrading your quality of life or something. I'm not sure what to put. It's like people, the story they tell themselves about how the world works, they are not very likely just to drop just because somebody claims that is not the real thing, right? They stick to it like, they're clutching at straws, right? And for good reason. It is evolutionarily advantageous to treat it as something outside yourself, as the thing itself, right?
Submit to you that it's on the edge of sanity. It can be something that you believe if you think casually about things, if you don't go in depth. But after a couple of 100 years of mainstream physicalism, having had the time to think this through, it doesn't take much effort to think this through. I don't think this is reasonable. I think it is on the edge of sanity, and it's only taken seriously, it only has a degree of plausibility because we have massive cultural consensus around it, unthought through cultural consensus whose great advantage is that it's based on inherited assumptions, unquestioned.
No, I would say it's a built-in axiom that human beings work from. It's an ingrown, evolutionarily evolved axiom that's the closest I can get to it, right? If you have like a 9-year-old son or daughter, and you try to explain to them that their father, their experiencing is not their real father, but only an experience of their father, you should see them behave, right? Or you see them start crying and become very, very insecure about what you're actually trying to do to them, right? So apparently you do not have children, right? And if you do, have you actually explained this to a child at 8 or 9, that you are actually not the real father, but you're just an experience, right? It doesn't bode well for communicating, right, with children. So children are in that axiom, and that's what they are developing. And it's and then it gets, as he says, it gets solidified by the culture and all the people working from this implicit. And it works with science and all things, all that stuff, right? So it's like it's never challenged, and it's so ingrown into you that, people like, let's say, the free market philosopher like Stefan Molyneux, he's sort of completely dogmatic about this. He's a militant materialist or physicalist, right? There's even the sharpest argument about idealism, it will be rejected just because it is idealism. So it's like, nope, I can't see it. No, I can't see it. See no evil, hear no evil, touch no evil, whatever, right? So it's like, it's so built, it's so ingrained in human beings, and I can speak for myself, right? It's only within the last 5, 6, or 7 years that I've been realizing that an idealist approach is much more correct than materialism, right?
Inherited assumptions. So the plausibility of mainstream physicalism is culturally manufactured. It's not something that arises from clear, objective reasoning or evidence. It doesn't arise from that. So in a nutshell, according
the problem of philosophy is also like skepticism and doubt, right? The big hurdles for philosophy is that if a general understanding of this experience reaches far beyond what you can actually claim from that experience, trying to pull people back to a more skeptical approach to things
To physicalism, the world is made of these abstract entities called atoms and elementary subatomic particles. You cannot visualize them because they have no qualities in and of themselves. They are just describable through quantities and the mathematical equations that relate these quantities to one another. So the world as it is in itself is a set of abstract quantitative relationships, abstract mathematical relationships. And when we, equally abstract entities, look at the world, then these abstract quantities inside our head, which we call brain, somehow magically generates the actual world that is given to us, or the dashboard, the qualities, the instrument panel that we have. These qualities are supposedly epiphenomenal. They are secondary side effects, literally side effects, because they don't have any efficacy. They, under mainstream physicalism, experience does nothing. It doesn't belong in the causal nexus of the world. Experience just accompanies the fall of the dominoes that is supposed to be causally close purely in abstract terms. This is what mainstream physicalism basically says. Now, there is, of course, an encapsulation of the key, well, I could say difficulty, but the key insoluble problem of physicalism. And to be able to frame this problem correctly, I think, is halfway to the solution. And the framing of this problem was done back in the 90s by this guy here, David Chalmers. There he is. He is probably the best known philosopher alive. I know Dave, and he doesn't put himself down, but he likes to say that, well, I did nothing back in the 90s. Everybody knew about what I called the hard problem of consciousness. All I did was to frame it unambiguously and clearly in few words, instead of some hand waving and that was going on at the time. He just framed it very clearly. And he doesn't think that this is a big deal, what he did. Well, I happen to think it was a very big deal, because framing a problem is halfway to solving it, or halfway to seeing it not as a problem, but as just a reduction to absurdity of certain assumptions, which is what I think this is. But since then, it has become known as the hard problem of consciousness. And it can be framed as is written here. There is nothing about the physical properties of the arrangements of particles making up our brain, in terms of which we could deduce, at least in principle, what it feels like to fall in love, have a bellyache, or look and taste an apple. For matter is defined precisely as that which lacks all felt qualities. So if you say that matter is exhaustively defined by a list of numbers, and numbers are, of course, have nothing to do with qualities. Quantities and qualities are two incommensurable domains. If you define matter as pure quantity, of course, you can never deduce qualities from that, unless you have an empirical mapping. But that doesn't show you that matter is generating experience. It just shows you that there is a correlation between a description and the thing described, which, of course, there is by construction. A correct description is constructed so as to correlate with the thing described. So he framed this in a way that makes it clear that this is not really a problem that can be solved in the future. This reveals an internal inconsistency of the mainstream physicalist narrative. You cannot start from qualities, then describe them through quantities, and then try to replace the reality of the qualities with those quantities, and finally try to pull the territory out of the map, try to deduce qualities from those quantities that you replaced reality with. You replaced the reality of the world with its description. You replaced the territory with the map.
Yeah, so the hard problem comes from, in one way of seeing it, the physicalists say, okay, because of our physicalist approach to metaphysics, we should be able to solve this problem of how these quantifications all of a sudden becomes like the color of an apple, or the smell of roses, or the shape of an elephant, or whatever, right? It's correctly said that, but it's still it's an artifact of a too far reaching. If you're saying I'm experiencing the actual outside, there's something that outside is experienced by, right? That is my experience. So I should be able to correlate how that scientific description of the world becomes my experiential version, right? But correctly, as Bernardo Kastrup states, but that was what you did before, right? Right? These abstractions derived from your experience cannot suddenly become that which creates the experience, right? It's basically a weird circular kind of argument, right? So it's but the hard problem is not really a hard problem. It's an impossible problem, right? Because if you think that you have a description about that outside should be able to explain how it becomes the experience. And that's the fallacy of bad metaphysics, right? It's a fallacy that arrives from bad metaphysics. If you're saying, well, all my experience is in here, and the experience is at most a placeholder of something outside I do not have access to, well, that outside is what at some point becomes your experience. But as I say, because it's before the experience, you have no access to it, because it has to become an experience before you can even have any idea about it, right? So the problem of how something becomes your experience is impossible, is insolvable. It's a question you can ask, but it's an answer you cannot get to.
Map, and you're trying to recover the territory from the map, which is absurd. Of course, you cannot succeed in that. And this is how this framing of the hard problem allows you to realize that whatever acrobatics, theoretical or conceptual acrobatics we do, there is a fundamental incommensurability between quantities and qualities. The correlation between the two is not because quantities generate qualities, it's because we created the quantities so as to describe the qualities. So let's try to wrap this now based on this discussion.
This is not to say that scientific endeavors are completely useless. You want qualities, you want to qualify your experience, so you know what to fight and what to flee from, what to fuck and what to feed on, right? That's sort of what keeps your existence going. And also that a reason why people keep going back to, is there a meaning to life apart from just staying alive, right? And it's hard to find because I don't think it's there. But just because it isn't there doesn't mean that you can make your own meaning of your life. There's just nobody that can tell you, because you're alone in your experience and your interpretation of your experience. So a meaning of life is something that comes from you inside, right? And that's why it's a good idea to start philosophizing and getting a grip on things and realizing that you are alone with your experience and your judgment of whether or not you want to have some axiom about your meaning of life, right? Nobody can give you meaning. They can help you philosophize, but they can't give the sort of snap your finger solution to your life. Don't trust it, right? I would say don't trust anything that just, hey, this is how you do it. No, keep thinking and keep philosophizing, right?
Can we say that mainstream physicalism is, one, logically coherent, 2, internally consistent. 3, conceptually parsimonious. 4, empirically adequate. Or 5, explanatorily powerful. Note, these 5 questions are the key values of the post-Enlightenment world, of our rational culture. We value logical coherence. We value internal consistency. We value conceptual parsimony. We have a name for that. You know, if you comply to Occam's razor and you survive Occam's razor, then your theory is conceptually parsimonious. Otherwise, although it perhaps can't be disproven, we don't need to take it seriously. So that's.
But you can't have one theory and then pass it through Occam, right? That's not what Occam is there for. It's if you have 2 or more explanations that basically describes the same observation or occurrence or whatever, right? The different theories that actually basically describes the same thing. Then the one that needs fewest, axioms and sort of the fewest steps in order to get there is the one that is preferable. It's not proven. It's not sort of a strict. It's just like if you want to go from A to B, well, a straight line from A to B is preferable rather than going from A to F to G to Q to C to and then you get to B, right? It's just more efficient, and it's seeming like it's possibly closer to the most optimal way of describing it, right? It has more explanatory power, maybe, or sort of something like that. It's a better theory, but no, that's incorrect of me. Then it's not Occam, right? That is just a better theory. If it's the same descriptive power, but in fewer steps, you can say, to cut it short, then Occam's razor says, then you should go with the simple one, right? Okay.
It's conceptual parsimony. We enormously value empirical adequacy. If you have a theory about reality that is contradicted by certain empirical facts, observable facts, then your theory is wrong. And we, of course, value explanatory power. If we have a theory of reality that doesn't explain the most important things, the most obvious things, then your theory is pointless because it doesn't explain anything. And the point of a theory is to try to make sense of things. So let's evaluate mainstream physicalism according to these post-Enlightenment values, which are espoused by every serious thinking physicalist in the world today. Number one, is it logically coherent? I would say it is not, because you see, it is trying to explain mind, consciousness, experience, qualities. It's trying to explain these mental things in terms of an abstraction of mind itself, namely matter as conceptually defined under mainstream physicalism. Mainstream physicalism postulates this theoretical entity, this theoretical abstraction called matter, which is exhaustively definable in terms of quantities. This is a theoretical postulate, an abstraction of the physicalist's mind. So, and then the physicalist tries to reconstruct or explain his own mind in terms of an abstraction of his mind. This is like a dog chasing its tail at light speed. I mean, it doesn't matter how fast you go, you're not going to catch it because it's just logically incoherent to do that. Now, is physicalism internally consistent? In other words, are all its postulates and tenets consistent with one another, or are there internal contradictions in physicalism? I would say there is a flagrant internal contradiction under mainstream physicalism, which is the following. After it defines matter conceptually as that which has no qualities, because matter is supposed to be exhaustively describable through quantities alone. So it defines matter as that which has nothing to do with qualities. It has no qualities intrinsically or inherently. It then tries to account for qualities, for experience, in terms of matter. Now, these are two things that are not internally consistent. You cannot try to account for qualities in terms of something that you came up with and defined in such terms that it doesn't have any qualities, that it's incommensurable with qualities. Now, is mainstream physicalism conceptually parsimonious? I would say it is not. For something to be conceptually parsimonious, it has to make only as many conceptual postulates as absolutely necessary to explain things. And physicalism makes this postulate beyond nature's given. Nature's given, all we have when we are 5 years old and before we start theorizing, is experience. The world around us is a world of qualities. It's a world of experience, of colors, of sounds, flavors, smells, textures that we feel. These are things we feel, qualitative things in experience. That's nature's given. What mainstream physicalism does is it says, well, next to these experiences, and fundamentally outside and independent of these experiences, there is something else which is not experiential at all. We will call it matter, and we will say it's fully definable in terms of quantities alone. So you're postulating an extra beyond nature's given. You're postulating an extra beyond immediate experience. And then that would be justifiable if you cannot make sense of things without making that postulate. But as I'm going to argue in part 4 of this course, we can make sense of everything in terms of experience alone. So on that basis, mainstream physicalism is not conceptually parsimonious. It fails Occam's razor. Is it empirically adequate? I would say, well, recent experimental results from the fields as diverse as neuroscience of consciousness and foundations of physics flat out contradict mainstream physicalism. In foundations of physics, since the late 70s, there have been increasingly more sophisticated loophole-free verifications of what is technically called Bell's inequalities and Leggett's inequalities. And verifying those inequalities has come to a point now in which it is way beyond reason to deny that there are only two options on the table. Either what we call physical entities, material things, either they do not have standalone reality. Matter is actually secondary, it's not primary. It's the way something else, non-physical, non-material, is presenting itself to our observation. Either this, or there has to be countless gazillions of new physical universes being born every infinitesimal fraction of a femtosecond, for which we have precisely zero empirical evidence. Now, you take your pick. My pick is obvious. Of course, matter has no standalone existence. Of course, the physical world has no standalone existence, because it is the dashboard of dials. And the information on that dashboard of dials is not arising from the dashboard, it's arising from the real world that the dashboard of dials is measuring, is observing. That real world is what is primary, is what has standalone existence, not the position of the dials. The position.
There he makes a connection as if he, by looking at the dials, can say something about that which the dials is based on. He cannot. This is an important step. He keeps pounding, he tries to puncture this transparent windscreen, right? And to try to look inside and use words that indicates or, sort of starts to point in that direction. This is dangerous. Just keep your mind, keep your focus on when he does this, right? Because he's going to end up telling you something about what is out there.
Of the dials is secondary. It arises from a measurement of the real world, which we cannot see directly. So, of course, if physicality is your dashboard, of course physicality has no standalone existence. And that's why Bell's and Leggett's inequalities are experimentally verified again and again and again for 40 years, with all loopholes closed. Why did we make it so difficult on ourselves? Because we have this physicalist prejudice. The result is obvious. Of course, physicality does not have standalone existence. It's not there before you measure, in the same sense that the dials are not giving you indications of what's going on outside unless the outside is being measured, unless the outside is being observed. And even in the neuroscience of consciousness, there is now a variety of total...
No. So the problem here is that a physicalist thinks that what they are measuring and describing using these scientific standards is the actual thing outside themselves, right? What they're actually measuring is their experience of something that they don't have access to, right? That is an experience of the outside if you go from that axiom, but then it's just a description of somebody's experience, right? Science is a built-in axiom that if I describe this experience in this particular fashion, the same should be valid for you. If I describe, Newton's laws or the second law of thermodynamics or whatever, the same law is applicable to you, but that's a sort of a built-in axiom. Just because I've made some science doesn't necessarily mean that this science is supposed to work for everybody else. But that's sort of a built-in, because it's derived, or the notion is derived from this false or incorrect metaphysics that sort of, if I'm describing the outside and those people out there are also in that outside, they should be experiencing the same outside, and therefore I can tell them about science, right? Because they are in the same, they are having exactly one-to-one experience. No, the problem is with idealism is it's my particular subjective experience. I am using a scientific principle to describe it, but that doesn't mean that the same experience is in another person. So it subjectifies science. It doesn't invalidate science, but it subjectifies science to, I have done some science, I have made this description, but that science doesn't mean that I can tell you this science works for you also. Basically, everyone doing science should say, this is my science, right? It doesn't mean that everybody, it doesn't mean that people can't choose to follow whatever other people have done of science. I do that all the time, right? People have done science in order to create my car. I'm simply not able to make science enough to validate whether or not I think it's functional as that function the car gives me. I'm just trusting the science, so to say, or driving across a bridge, or, that my MacBook here is going to function. I'm just trusting the science, but that doesn't mean that it's objective as such, right? The science done is subjective by those who have created the stuff, and they're saying, I've created this product using science. You can choose to trust it, you can choose not to trust it. That's it, right? And when we get down to this sort of science thing, that is, everybody should be able to say no thank you to whatever somebody else have made of science, because it's based on their subjective experience, right? So when somebody called Dr. Fauci comes and tell you, we have done the science, you should inject yourself with this experimental jab, you should be able to say, no thank you, I don't trust the science, right?
Independent but converging lines of evidence showing that there are consistent cases in which significant reductions in brain activity, but I define activity as metabolism. Significant reductions in brain metabolism are accompanied by mind-boggling increases in experiential richness and intensity. Now, if brain metabolism somehow is or generates experience, you would expect there to be some kind of proportionality, direct proportionality between the two. You wouldn't expect experience to explode in richness and intensity while your brain is effectively going to sleep. So that's also hard to make sense of under mainstream physicalism. So it is not empirically adequate. And finally, is it explanatorily powerful at all? Well, I would say this is the worst of the 5 criteria as far as physicalism is concerned, because it cannot explain experience. Remember the hard problem? There is nothing about...
Well, idealism can't explain idealism either, or experience either. Idealism just, skeptical, retraction into saying, no, I can't claim it's an outside, but that doesn't, just because I stay with the inside only approach to experience, that doesn't mean I'm starting to explain it, right? Because my firm belief is, firm understanding is, you can't explain it. And what would you also be explaining? If it's an experience of something that is outside which you do not have access to, what are you explaining? The experience is there's no connection to the real thing, right? You can fabulate all you want about what might be out there. You only have your experience. But if your experience is that which you use in order to get around in that which you do not have access to, I would say that yes, it's important that you realize that you are in that thing you can't experience, but you only have your experience. Your experience is evolutionarily honed to get around in that which you do not have access to. But that doesn't explain anything about the experience other than it's there for you to handle, right? So when it all comes down, it's about figuring out how to use what you have and not explain that which you do not have access to, right?
Physical parameters in terms of which we could deduce the qualities of experience, at least in principle. So there is a strong sense in which mainstream physicalism explains precisely nothing, because experience is all we have. Everything beyond experience is a theoretical abstraction that is itself experiential. So, I'm sorry,
an abstraction is not experiential. Now you need to be clear here, right? An abstraction is based on experience. So an abstraction cannot itself also be an experience. You could say it's a part of your consciousness or your mind. If you, compartmentalize everything that goes on in any part of this thing inside the brain, well, then you could say it's a part of mind. But there are experiences and there are also conceptualizations, I would say, right? Or cognitions, you could say. A cognition is not something that arrives through a cognitive sense, right? You could say the windscreen you talked about before are the colors, the smells, the sounds, and so on, right? And sort of on this screen. On top of that, a transparent kind of conceptualization is placed. That's the elephant and the lamp and the MacBook and the cheese and the cloud, right? The cloud doesn't arrive, right? It's put on the experience. So the cloud is not an experience. That is a conceptualization, right? What you derive from the experience cannot be it's yet another paradigm, right? It's another part. The conceptualization of your experience is another paradigm than your experience, I would say, right?
Realism doesn't explain much at all. And then you might ask, let me add some commentary here that I didn't plan, but I will add. Why did we come to physicalism if it's so bad? How did it happen? Well, it happened in the early days of science and towards...
No. It's just solidified there, right? It's how human beings work. It's a built-in axiom. It's sort of a natural conclusion about your experience that you don't even... It's so real in a sense, right? That you don't even question it, right? It's so natural to just take it as an outside because I see my hand here outside my head, right? So it must be outside. It's sort of a natural conclusion that you don't, because there's nothing to challenge it really other than your mental gymnastics that sort of, as Bernardo Kastrup and I have done, right, sort of reasoning from one step to the other, figuring out, well, this can't be the case and this must be sort of, and we're also dealing with something we do not have access to, right? So it's also this problem with, but if I don't have access to it, how can I fabulate about it? Well, I can't. The only thing I can see that there's possibly something there which I do not have access to, right? So it's sort of the problem of this kind of metaphysics is not really a problem within metaphysics. It when it becomes a problem is in epistemology, when you start to claim what you know. If you think what your experience is a one-to-one of the outside, you are claiming knowledge about that outside. If you're an idealist, you can only limit yourself to claim what you experience. So all knowledge is fundamentally subjective from the get-go if you're an idealist, right? This is a step that most idealists even won't take, right? They won't even stick to their own axioms.
It's the end of the Renaissance, the beginning of the Enlightenment, when there was an enormous conflict between the nascent science and the church, which had full control not only of the metaphysical narrative of the time, but over the whole society of the time. The church was the lawmaker, the judge, everything circled around the church. And the church burned a couple of scientists. The famous case of Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake in the year 1600, is only one example. So scientists, Descartes specifically, they wanted to find a way to carve out a space for science to be done without scientists being burned at the stake. And one clear way to do that was to say, okay, there is mind, and that's the domain of the church, because mind in Greek is psyche, and psyche also means soul. So mind, soul, psyche, that's the domain of the church. We scientists will say nothing about that. But there is this other thing called matter, which is definable in terms purely of quantities. We will postulate that this other thing exists, and we will study only this thing. So the church has mind, and we have matter. And that was a great political move. And now, look, some might say, well, I am interpreting history wrong, and I have heard this from scholars, and maybe I'm exaggerating my point, but my point is not purely invented, because French materialists of the Enlightenment are on record. Diderot, for instance, said precisely this: materialism is problematic. It was called materialism at the time, mainstream physicalism. It's at least not complete. That's what he said. Because, we cannot account for subjectivity in terms of our definition of matter. However, we should keep on using it because it's a great weapon against the church. And I assume he meant a defensive weapon against the church. So this was going on. This was there. And other psychological dynamics played out in the late 19th century. I even wrote a paper about it, published on Sage Open, the world's best read academic psychology journal, which reinforced this materialist narrative because of what psychologists call fluid compensation. And in the second half of the 19th century, when we killed God, as Nietzsche said, we killed God, when we abandoned the idea of an almighty, and we pronounced that was against reason and evidence, we lost that source of meaning that came from religious transcendence. Religious transcendence imparts meaning upon our lives, even when things are going wrong, and that's essential to healthy human life. And we lost that by rejecting transcendence at all. And so we had to find, or at least the scientists who were promoting materialism had to find another source of meaning through fluid compensation. And they found that extra source of meaning in identifying themselves as a rational elite who stared the tough facts in the face, who were brave enough to carry on despite the complete nihilistic absence of meaning in life, and who survived their own death through the work, this cosmological work they did in trying to make sense of nature and achieving closure. So these are all alternative sources of meaning which motivated the militant materialists and set the entire value system under which we live today. The notion that anybody who is an idealist is probably a irrational, new age, woo-woo, flaky person, even if that person is leveraging only reason and evidence.
There is certainly a large risk of becoming some kind of woo-woo, right? And I would say Bernardo Kastrup won't go completely free of this, right? But it also attracts a lot of woo-woo people, woo-woo types, that can put all sorts of mysticism, let's say, into that realm you do not have access to, right? They can put everything there that they want to be there. So there's a God out there, or there's a larger mind out there, or that's where the government exists, and that's where society and culture exist. So it's there, but you can't access it. So you need to listen to your priest or your politician or your peers and whatever, right? So it's usually ends up being some kind of mind control, and manifested in whatever, it becomes inquisitions and crusades and whatever it ends up becoming, right? And you have to pay up, right?
Evidence to much greater depths than the militant materialists. It set that value system to the point that today there are many militant physicalists or materialists who do not know what physicalism is. I mean, I always mention Jerry Coyne because it's the most extreme case of somebody who contradicts materialism all over the place in trying to defend materialism. And he's abundantly on record doing exactly that. The militants are not the people who really actually investigate the question. They are, through fluid compensation, trying to carve out a space of meaning for themselves. These are not neutral, objective people. But anyway, that's what I had to say about physicalism. In part 3, we are going to do a similar exercise for the new fashion in the metaphysical world, which is constitutive panpsychism, the idea that every...
So yeah. It's sort of a half-baked attempt at extending the shelf life of materialism slash physicalism. So you could say it's an interesting mind trick, but it doesn't explain anything. On the contrary, it brings all sorts of new problems to the fray.
Or at least some elementary subatomic particles are conscious in and of themselves, fundamentally conscious. That consciousness is just another fundamental property of matter, like mass, electric charge, spin, momentum. Well, you also have experiential states as a fundamental property of matter. I will argue that such an idea is physically incoherent. It contradicts what we know in foundations of physics, at least since the 1950s. And there are a number of other reasons why it's an untenable alternative metaphysics, despite being very fashionable today in academia. So stay tuned for that, for part 3. Again, I recommend you don't go and jump straight to part 3. I recommend you give yourself a day or two just to think about what you've heard today, to let it be integrated into your view of the world, let it have its effect, and then we go to the next part. So until then, stay safe, and I will see you shortly. Take care.
And the same from here. Stay safe. I see you shortly. I hope you have... it's interesting to you too. I haven't seen anybody else trying to comment or deconstruct Bernardo Kastrup's metaphysics in this fashion as I'm doing. So it's sort of a pioneering work, you could say. I don't know what term to put on it, right? But I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you makes you think a bit, at least. That I like that there's some more than one approach to kind of thinking, right? So if I'm the only one thinking this, can't I find somebody else who have some similar kind of thought, but maybe slightly different, right? That would be more parsimonious, more correct. So throw my mind against, or my own arguments against, right? So by me trying to throw my arguments against Bernardo Kastrup, there might actually be some middle ground somewhere where the best explanation is. So it's just, an old virtue of, philosophical discourse that I'm trying to establish here, right? So give me a comment, give me a like, subscribe, and all that, and consider donations, or go and discuss this on the Discord server, link below, hopefully. Otherwise, find a link in an earlier video. And otherwise, see you in the next one.